can you upgrade?
I'm sorry, Elizabeth,
Can you upgrade Allison? I believe she's here as an attendee.
was she? I didn't see her a minute ago,
Oh,
but
she
if
might
she's
not be
good-
here yet.
Yep, there she is. There she is. I see her. Yep, I'll put her in.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, 6:02, let's call the meeting to order. Good evening, everybody.
Oh, Dr. Bryant is in the, I'm promoting her now as well.
Okay, great. Great. This is meeting number 40, milestone. How about that? Nancy, you've got the attendance.
Yes, I do.
Thank you. Old business, we've got minutes from March 9th for approval. Do we have any changes from anybody?
Move approval of the minutes, March 9th.
All right, moved by Mr. Berman, seconded by, do we have a second? Lois raises her hand reluctantly. Thank you, Lois. All right, no comments then. All in favor of approving the minutes of March 9th, please raise your hands. Anybody opposed? You know what, do that one more time, please. This is difficult. All in favor, please raise your hands. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right, great. Thank you. Motion passes. All right, so we've got under new business committee reports. Let's start with Leah on space planning and technology, please.
Hello, everybody. So we are still plugging away at figuring out, refining the space plan, particularly when it comes to the technology. The main things we're working on right now are the process, really. How many IT rooms are we going to have, one on each floor, and making sure that those spaces are adequate for the people who will be working on them, and talking about what the workflow is for the technology planning moving forward. So lots of stuff going on there, but nothing concrete just yet. But yeah.
Questions for Leah? Don't see any. I just want to thank all the many town staff people that are assisting with this in addition to their day job. I mean, we've got, beside the library staff, which I'm just in awe about how much you guys know about this stuff. So it's great to have you aboard. Thank you. We've got Glenn Garrity from Public Works, Scott Charlo, our IT director. So it's a huge endeavor, and everybody's putting a lot of time and effort into it. So thank you on that. All right, next committee, let's go to Bob Berman, owner rep. Anything to report?
We don't have a report at this time. We're still hoping to be on schedule to present at the something at the April 6th committee meeting, and we'll see where we stand at that time. That's it. Thank you.
Questions for Bob? All right, last but not least is our outreach committee. And as I said before the meeting, Maxine is running late. She did submit a brief report, an update that Nancy distributed to everybody. So really the gist of that is that their next meeting is scheduled for the first week in April to develop a plan for sharing schematic design with the public. That's outreach. I don't know if anybody has any comments. I did just hear from Kinjal. He's having some technical difficulties, but he's trying to get in. All right, so that's committee reports. Let's move to Elizabeth, director's report, please.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to start off by saying we were hopeful that the $1 million grant would be discussed at the March 25th bond commission meeting, but that meeting has been canceled. We are now hoping that we will be on the agenda for April 29th, and I have emailed our local legislators to ask them to reach out to the governor to make sure we are on there. So if anybody feels like reaching out on behalf of the library building committee, that would be great. I also wanted to discuss that we are starting to plan for submission for the McMahon-Wittenberry grant. That is due September 1. And we are talking and looking at timelines due to the fact that the earliest we would be able to spend that $1 million would be most likely January. And there's just some red tape around that. So we're continuing to explore that. We are also continuing to explore our relationship with the Board of Education. We have a very deep relationship with the board, and we are hoping to strengthen that relationship come this fall when we move into our swing spaces. We are hoping that we will be able to have a more concrete presence in the actual schools. And that would be hopefully across the system, with the largest presence most likely in the high school. So we're going to continue to explore that. And I want to say thank you to Jesse White for helping us move that conversation forward. Bob Berman and I are continuing to look at spaces for swing spaces. The library staff is going to look at one of those potential spaces tomorrow, and we should have more feedback very soon about that. The library, as of April 4th, is extending their hours to open up at 10 a.m. Monday through Saturday at both locations. I wanted to talk about the importance of soundproofing in the new buildings. Specifically Prosser. I know that sound is something that is important to libraries, and I just wanted us all to think about what that sound experience should be like. And I also wanted to just talk a little bit about the facade. We're getting a lot of comments at the library from the public. And I know that in the beginning, there was a lot more glass and less brick, and now we have a lot more brick and less glass. And I just wanted to say that I hope that whatever design we end up with is the one that is the most welcoming for the public, and as for many people in the public as possible. And then finally, I wanted to end with an announcement about one of our illustrious library building committee members, Ms. Christine Grant. She has been accepted to be honored at 100 Women of Color Gala coming up. And as we all know, she works at the University of Hartford. And I'm going to read from the press release. One of the goals through its associated nonprofit organization is to build financial support for many programs that help advance the careers of young women, which is why Grant has the highest regard for this distinction she is soon to receive. And we know that she's very honored, but we're very honored to have her presence on the library building committee and her guidance as we move forward in this process. So if everyone could join me in just giving her a quick little round of applause.
Woohoo! Way to go, Chris.
Congratulations.
Congratulations.
Well deserved.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Questions for Elizabeth? Regarding the potential schedule for the state grant on McMahon, I know we're going to hear from Downs in their report on what all that could mean and how we go forward exploring those possibilities. So thanks, Elizabeth, for doing all that. So let's go. Next on the agenda is an update from TSKP, who is not with us tonight. I did speak with Richard Sipic recently, a project architect. I had a conversation with Tai Su last week. I know he is working on all the comments that he has received from the public and from us. Richard most recently responded that he would have the results of all that for our next meeting, which I'm quite anxious to see how he's responding to all the comments that have come forward. And I realize that does put us past the end of March officially for the conclusion of schematic design, but I think it's important we get it right, that we're all happy, and we don't go forward until schematic design is where we want it to be. So I think we're close, and the comments have been well received, including the comments that Elizabeth made tonight. Anyone have anything regarding TSKP at this point?
But it looks like Kinjal has joined us. So
Great. Okay, Kinjal's with us. All right, so let's move on to Downs, who is very well represented tonight. We've got Tom and Scott and Kyle. The floor is yours.
Good evening, everyone. Nice to see everyone. We'll let Kyle go ahead.
Just getting my screen up.
Yeah.
All right, so our project update, we have our budget summary. We've updated with the latest invoice approvals. So we're tracking that down to our schedule update. We have been tracking the schematic design at the end of March, design development through the end of May. Our 100% CD documents we've been tracking for August, approximately August 9th. And early demolition and abatement bid documents we're tracking for the end of July of 2022. And the library grant contract status, Scott's going to walk us through this one right here.
Yep. So as Elizabeth mentioned, the grant contract is with the bonding commission, so that's up for review. With McMahon, in light of the recent information that Elizabeth went through, the application process for McMahon has some effect on the schedule. Due to the guidelines within the grant, we cannot essentially get contracts out and signed until that grant is approved. So we know for Prosser we'll be fine to start in September, but in October that could be an issue. So there's some items that we need to think about as far as McMahon goes. If McMahon does start later, it doesn't mean that we can't take bids at the same time as Prosser, but ironing out that schedule of the grant and understanding it better as we're starting to more with McMahon, that could be an issue where we could lose some efficiency in the bid process, where we may have to separate out the bids and bid the McMahon project at a later time. One thing we need to think about is, can the grant be assigned to specific components of the project that doesn't affect trade bids like FF&E? That's something that, we can definitely think about. We want to be aware of our ever changing escalation costs, which obviously we're going through now. And then, by possibly not starting McMahon in October, we lose some momentum on getting an early bid package out for demolition. So these are some of the things that we're thinking about, and we're going to continue to talk about with the team and how we're going to manage that. Is there any questions?
I don't see any hands raised. I just want to comment on that, and I thank everybody for starting to look at this. If we do compromise our McMahon construction schedule to accommodate potentially this grant from the state, it looks like we're going to be losing some buying power, if you will. You got to remember that $1 million is not in addition to what we're allowed to spend. It's just instead of bonding money. So there are some costs that it looks like costs would go up. we'll lose some buying power in the bidding process. We'll lose buying power in our soft costs. We can get into that in more detail later, but my feeling is that the compromise is to, if the schedule remains delayed for McMahon, we're just going to get less of a bang for the buck on the project. So we'll, like Scott said, we'll continue to look at it and analyze. But in the meantime, we'll go forward with pursuing the grant. Okay, Scott and Kyle, I'll let you continue.
Mark, I'd like to add one more thing on the grant process, just kind of as a bigger picture. Just to kind of take one step back, the McMahon Library construction schedule was about 5 months shorter than the Prosser schedule. So one of the things that we're looking at is to kind of work through the aspects of not having McMahon finish after Prosser. So there is a little bit of float in there. And to Mark's point with the buying power, I think our original approach was to have both of these jobs bid at the same time, so contractors can provide some sort of combination bids and take advantage of some of the trades working simultaneously on both sites. So we're going to circle back on that. And I think maybe as part of our schematic design estimate, since that's coming up in the next couple weeks, we can kind of take a deeper dive and maybe kind of off to the side, we'll have a separate analysis of kind of putting some costs to some of these items so that, at the end of our schematic design phase, we can, make an informed decision of how the delayed grant schedule on the timetable adjustment affects the overall budget. If that seems like we can kind of merge that into our schematic design, our schematic estimate analysis.
All right, thanks, Tom. And if we decide that a delay in the schedule is prohibitive, we may be able to take some special actions with the grant, but that's down the road. We'll keep an eye on that as well.
Right.
Bob Berman, you've got your hand up.
Yes, I do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the things I want to point out also, it's an issue with postponing it, is the fact that we're going to have an issue with the plan of conservation development in that nobody knows when that's actually going to be in place. And I don't know whether or not the library board and the bonding commission are going to be favorable toward giving us anything without that in place. Because the chances of that being in place in a timely manner for when we apply for the grant, when they go, number one, number two, when it goes on the bonding commission and they approve it, and then before we can sign a contract, that has to be in place. And I don't know that that's going to be in place in time. That's another wrinkle that we need to be aware of, that can throw a monkey wrench into applying for the grant or postponing doing anything on McMahon.
Right, a lot of moving pieces and parts. Lois, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I thought I asked that question about the plan of conservation and development in the last meeting. And someone said it didn't have to be completed. So I'm confused about where the completion of the conservation and development plan comes in.
Well,
Yes.
my understanding is that it cannot be expired. We have to have a working plan. Now, whether that's some legal extension of our present one or whether it's a new one, those are questions. But it just cannot be, the status of it cannot be expired when it's certain.
I see. Well, I would think the thing to do would be to ask the town council to continue it, or the zoning commission, I guess that it's in their purview, to ask them to continue it for 6 months while they do the work on the new one. And I don't see why that would be a problem, really, if they know that the library depends on it. And the other question that I have is that I guess I'm not getting the fundamental problem here about the grant and the timing. What is it that's the problem with McMahon? I just didn't understand that when you mentioned it.
Oh, well, as the grant stands now, all of these grants, that you cannot purchase any equipment or furniture or sign any kind of construction contract until it is until we sign the contract with the state. So if you look at our process with PRASA right now, we're waiting for this bond commission meeting to happen, at which point we will sign the contract with the state. So if McMahon proceeds, this happens repeat every year. So if the same schedule happened next year for McMahon, we wouldn't be able to award a construction contract till roughly a year from now, as opposed to when we're looking to do it, which would be, this fall. However, I know Elizabeth has been asking the state about that timeline, and they've suggested it could be as early as January, which is still a delay. I think that's wishful thinking, because with PRASA, we're looking at next month.
I know we want and need this money, but I thought the referendum was passed for the amount of money that we needed, and we hoped to get the grants in addition. So I don't understand why we have to wait and have the contract signed, holding up the project, if that's a problem for us. We have the money authorized by the community.
Correct, and the grant money does not increase
Right.
the budget. It just gives us funding from a different source.
Right.
But we're not eligible for the money unless we wait and do not sign a contract for any kind of construction until it's approved. So we would not be able to award any work at McMahon until then. That's just a stipulation of the grant.
Because if we do, we nullify our opportunity to have the grant. Is that what you're telling me?
That's right. That's right.
Okay, there must be some way around this. Elizabeth, I'm sure you'll find it.
Yes, and Lois, I wanted to tell you that we are going to investigate all ways and see if there's anything that we can do. I also wanted to say that as for the POCD, I'm sure many of you know we have a new director of planning and development, Jennifer Valentino Rodriguez, and this did come up at department heads today. And apparently we can ask for extensions on the current POCD. It's a paperwork thing with the state, because creating a new one could be up to a 2-year process. So when I heard that, I like all my warning bells went off. But Jennifer assured us that there's ways to make sure that what we currently have on the books will work. And I'm going to be meeting with her to discuss this further in the next week or so, and hopefully we'll know more concrete about this and the state library process. And I'll be sure to report back everything.
Thank you.
Elizabeth, you had your hand up before that. Did you? Anything else?
No, thank you, Mark.
All right, then let's get back to Kyle and Scott.
Wake up.
Yeah, I think my screen is blocked here. Just a sec. Okay. So next item we have is the Eco Charrette. We held one on February 24th, and we're following up right now with Cynthia to see when the next one will be scheduled. I believe there's a series of 4 that we have to do with her. So we'll follow up with that and get a new date. For the town consultants, now we're only tracking the environmental consultant, SLR. They have completed the roof surveys and the interior testing of the 3 buildings as of last week. And it'll take probably a couple of weeks to formulate the reports, but we're going to follow up with SLR on just that. They actually had a question out to Nancy, so we're gonna follow up with them with our owners meeting and clarify when that'll actually happen. And I believe that's it.
Okay, questions for our construction manager? Lois?
I just want to ask that we all be included again in the eco charrette. It was very helpful and informative.
Yeah, of course. Definitely invite the same group and more if anyone else is interested.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, I thank you, Downs team, as usual. And next we have Nancy with approval of invoices.
Sorry, I was muted. We have one invoice for SLR for some preliminary work they've done on the environmental assessments. It's invoice number 168942, and it's for $11,691.50.
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Ike, seconded by
Second.
Mr. Berman. Thank you very much. Questions, comments? All in favor of approving the motion, please raise your hand. Anybody opposed? All right, motion passes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's it, Nancy, for invoices?
That's it.
Okay. All right, so meetings coming up. We've got April 6th and April 20th. As always, please let us know if you have a conflict. And that brings us to comments from the committee. Everybody's quiet.
Bob Berman.
Bob, thank you.
Chairman, one of the things I want to point out to the committee is to keep in mind for future time, just in the back of your heads. I'm hearing in my sources that the cost of materials has gone up substantially, much more than towns could have anticipated when they put together the first budget and when they revised it on the second as well. We have money set aside for contingency and FF&E in the budget. We already know from some of the things we've heard and we've seen as a committee that costs are going to be higher than we initially anticipated. So I just want everybody to be aware and be thinking in the back of their heads, we need to find ways to do this work more efficiently and economically where possible. Some places it won't be possible, some places it might be. We need to be thinking in those terms and thinking outside of the box because our funds are capped. We know that. So we just need to be aware of the fact that things are going to cost more than we all thought. Just look at the price of gasoline. I mean, the House of Representatives today just approved 3-month moratorium on what, 26 cents a gallon state tax. The Senate will probably approve it tomorrow. That's a three-month hiatus. That's not going to buy us much. But I think everybody needs to be aware that costs are going to escalate more than we initially thought. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Bob. Any other comments from the committee? All right, let's move on to public comments. Nancy, we have some hands up.
Let's see. Anybody from the public? First we have Sten Casperson. Okay, Sten, go ahead, unmute yourself.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Two quick comments in response to two items I just heard that I heard this evening. The first one is for the benefit of Elizabeth and soundproofing. Elizabeth and the library committee for the Human Services Facility recently completed a lesson learned. There were difficulties with adequate sound abatement when using room dividers. That is like the great room in the Human Services Facility. You pull the dividers across, you could get 1 room, 2 rooms, or 3 rooms. But it was found that the anticipated sound abatement between the rooms was not there. that was adjusted afterwards. And in concert with that, it was also learned that sound was being carried from room to, across from room to room above the hanging ceilings. There wasn't soundproofing all the way from floor to floor, upper ceiling. So just be aware of that in terms of the specs that go into the design. Second comment on material costs. Some familiarity with this. Generally, the increase in material costs also results or shows an increase in the time length, the schedule to obtain items, especially long lead items. So that should also be a question with respect to your bid process. Yes, it's going to cost more. How much longer is it going to take, and might it affect the schedule? Thank you.
Thank you, Sten. Anyone else?
Don't see any other hands up.
I don't see any other hands up either.
All right, thank you, members of the public. So with that, I will take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Wright and
Second.
seconded by Chris. Thank you very much. All in favor, please raise your hands. All right, motion passes. Thank you, everybody. We'll
Thank
see
you.
in,
Weeks.
we'll
Have a
see
good
you in
night.
2 weeks.
Night.
Take care.